Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you never miss an episode. Search for us on your favorite podcast app, or you can find the podcast on jimmyhinton.org and findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so we can spread the word. If you would like to support us and get exclusive rewards, go to patreon.com/speakingout. Find a tier that best fits you and join as a patron of the podcast. Now let's get into the show. All right. Welcome to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with host Jimmy Hinton.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And special guest with us today, Janitta Nichols. Janitta, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. So Janitta had reached out to us, and she has a very powerful story and an upcoming book. Well, I shouldn't say upcoming. Your book is out. When did your book publish? It was recently.
We released on Christmas.
Okay.
Awesome.
So very recent.
Wow.
Yeah. So we definitely wanted to give you opportunity to share your story and to talk about your book. And, you know, I was reading your bio, and I think it's really fascinating that you took your pain and, you used that and you went into law enforcement and spent some time there. Mm-hmm. And that's just always super encouraging whenever people, they take what happened to them and those horrific stories of pain and they use it for good.
Yeah. So I did about 5 years of law enforcement. And when I would say I thought I was going through my healing process, my heart was always to serve and to help other people who were like me. And in my mind, I thought that policing would be the best platform to do that on, because you come in direct contact with so many people who are hurting and what I like to consider it like their worst point in life. Like once you come in contact with police, that's not a good day. And so for me, that was the platform that I thought would be awesome to be able to be effective in doing that. And it's funny that once I got into it, I kind of felt the opposite. I felt like I wasn't able to do enough. I felt like all I was doing was coming in contact with someone at the worst point in their life and then sending them to another place of someone who can possibly help them. And whether that was arresting someone and sending them to jail and they got what they needed there, or whether it was maybe removing a child from a broken home and then hoping that they get what they needed from social workers.
I can definitely relate to that. Because, and I think going into advocacy was kind of the last thing that I ever wanted to do. And at one point my wife asked me, "Why are you doing this to yourself?" And I said, because I have to. Yeah. And I can relate to that, feeling that weight of, knowing at the end of the day, like you've exhausted yourself to answer one person and to sit with them for just a snapshot in time compared to what, the hill that they're up against to be able to heal. And it does weigh on you after a while.
Yeah, it definitely affected me. It definitely affected me when I would be, on a run and out, especially children. Children are like the thing that was the most precious to me. And when I would come in contact with the child and, I would want to spend more time or do more for this child, it's like I have to hurry up and get them to point A so that I can run to the next run or the next call. Mm-hmm. And that started to like really weigh on me to where I started to like wear that around at work, to where the compassion began to leave that I was able to have for people. And I became so robotic to the system of what we had to do. And that was very, very hard for me.
Janitta, that's a good word that you use, the robotic, because I think that happens to a lot of us when we're exposed to constant daily pain. It's almost like a coping mechanism, because don't you think we have to almost become that way because we know we're limited in what we can do. And if we open our hearts wide to all of that, is too much. It's just way too much.
And that was the only way you could really get through your days. I mean, as a cop, I would, respond to something that was disastrous, something that was very, hard for the normal, what I would consider normal civilian to see. And then you may leave something that's just that deep and impactful to going to someone complaining about a dog barking. And so you going through all these different things and seeing all these different experiences, that in order for you to get through it, you have to become numb to what you're seeing, because that's the only way. Otherwise, it was runs that I would go to and I would sit in my car and just cry. And I would have to call my husband, and I had to program myself to be able to just do my job, get out, not carry it, and do something else. And I feel like that took away a part of me that God created me with, which was that person who has a heart for people, who's very compassionate, who wants to fix everyone's problems, which sometimes can be my downfall. But it started to like sear that side of me to where I had to like hide that part of me in order to be able to get through my day to day.
Totally get it. Yeah.
Well, totally I want to back up in time a little bit and let you share part of your story and what led to you writing your book. And I want our listeners to hear your story and kind of where it all began.
Okay, I'll break it down for you because I will tell you it's very long. So, my story is just, it never ended, and my story is even continuing now. So but even as a child, I would say around the age of about 6, I was exposed to sex. I don't know what words I can say, but I'm very open and transparent. So
absolutely, go for it.
At about age of 6, I was exposed to sex by a family member. And if I can remember correctly, it was my cousin. And I had a cousin, it was actually brothers. One of them would force me to give him oral sex. And then the other one would pretty much have sex with me at a young age. And this continued through my whole childhood. And I want to say I was around 8 or 9 when my mother met her husband. She met her husband. It was 4 of us, and she got married to this man, and he was an abuser. I remember clearly the first day that he introduced me to sex and the day he made me uncomfortable. But at a young age, I was pretty much, I'm trying to find the correct word to say, I was pretty much taken advantage of because of my vulnerability. I was a child who just wanted to be loved. I loved affection. I loved compassion. I had an aunt and a grandmother who showed it to me frequently. So it was something I desired. And so when I would go home, I desired those same things. But I had a mother who was working all the time. In my opinion, she was addicted to alcohol. And so her going to the bar and the club was kind of her thing. And so me not knowing my father or having a relationship with a father, when my stepfather came, it was kind of like, okay, I have the father figure that I've been longing for. And I believe that he played on that. He saw my desire. He saw my need for that. And it was a way that he was able to kind of come into my world and offer something that I didn't have. And I believe that when I was around 8 was the first time that I was physically assaulted by him. I remember, I want to say I was 10 years old, and my cousin was finally arrested for the abuse that he caused me and my sister, because I found out my sister was also being abused by him. He ended up going away, and I remember riding in the car because my stepdad, one of the things that he did was he manipulated me into telling me that I couldn't tell my mother. It was kind of like he built this bond with me and this trust in me to where, hey, if you say something, not only are you going to get in trouble too, but you're going to ruin the world that we're trying to create for you. And so that manipulation and that tactic caused me to be in silence. It caused me to fear. But when I saw my mother react to my cousin the way that she did, I was like, oh, so it is safe to tell her. I can tell my mom what happened. And when I was about 10 years old, we were riding home from the hospital where I had to go to get a rape kit. And I turned the music down and I said, Mom, I need to tell you something. The same thing that, my cousin, which I won't name, was doing to me, my stepdad is doing the same thing. And she didn't say a word. She was silent. We rode home the rest of the way, and it was like pitch silent. And we walked into the house. And when we got into the house, my stepdad was in the room. My mother walked in there and she talked to him and told him what I said. They made me wait in the other room. And I come in the room, they call me in, and he's there. I'm talking about boohoo crying. Like, he had the whole theatrics. And how could you tell your mother I did something like this to you? I would never. I love you. I'm sorry, whatever. And it was just whole performance. And I'm looking at him and I'm looking at my mom, and she's soaking it all in. And I get punished. I get put on the punishment for lying and for saying something like that about my stepfather. And the next day he came into my room and he handed me a $20 bill and said, I told you not to say nothing. Now look what you did. And so for me, it was confusing, but it was also hurtful. And in that point, I kind of felt alone. And so from the age of, I would say 6 till about 15, I was victimized over 300 times. And it was predominantly by my stepfather. And so what led me into telling my stories, because as a child, I always knew that my story had some type of meaning. I never believed in God at this point, but it was like that feeling that you have to where it's like, there's a reason for all of this. And it was like this little piece of faith. It was like so small that existed in me that whatever I was going through, you know, I found my ways to cope through, and God always sent somebody to help me across that bridge of where I was. But it was always something in me just telling me like, there's greater and there's a reason for this story. And if I can come out of this story, I can help other people do the same thing. And I was never able to formulate that into a plan of the what, like, what am I supposed to do with it? And so I would say through my whole life, I struggled with depression. It caused me to suffer from, you know, personality things to where I couldn't figure out who I was. I struggled with my identity. And so as a teenage, I was afraid of men as a teenager, to where I turned my lifestyle, started dating women. And it was so much confusion for me because I didn't know my sexuality. I didn't know what I liked or where I belonged. I just know where I felt safe. I felt safe with women. It was like I didn't have a fear associated with them, but I had a fear associated with men. Every man that came into my life, because my abuse was from family members, I questioned their intention of being in my life.
Sure.
And so just to fast forward, because I want you guys to read the book to see some of the incidents. But the book was founded on the incident. And if you look at the front cover, this was the actual house that I was abused in. We went back and we reenacted the scene from the movie, the short film that I have, to where I found my stepfather molesting my sister. And this was kind of the turning point for us. This was the turning point for me. So I found him molesting my sister. And that's where the book starts. And he had this attitude where it was like, so what, you found me? And that angered me. And I said, I didn't care what you were doing to me. You know, I was going to suffer through it. I had a few more years till I was 18. But when I saw the look on my sister's face, it triggered something in me. And I fought him. Me and him began to fight right there in the hallway. And he beat me up pretty bad. And then I remember he dragged me across the floor and he dragged me into my room. And when I was in my room, I was laying there. My mother was incarcerated at the time. I felt like if she was to come home and hear about what happened, I would be the one to get in trouble because she wouldn't believe anything that we were saying.
Right.
The time that I told my mother when I was 10 wasn't the first time. I consistently told my mother over and over again what he was doing. And it became a game to him. He would say, I'll take you to tell her. And he did once. And she pretty much cursed me out for wasting her time. And so this day in my room, I laid on my floor and I didn't want to be here anymore. I felt like at that point, there's no purpose for me. What am I doing here? But I had 5 other brothers and sisters in the other room who I heard him screaming at, who I heard him cussing out, because one of my brothers tried to jump into the fight with me. And so I hear them getting beat and in trouble. And as I laid there and thought about killing myself, I felt like, well, who's going to protect them? Who's going to save them? And like I said, that same piece of faith I had in me as a kid, it just said, just get up and do something. And I tell people this all the time and they think it's corny, but I feel like this is the way that God got to me. It was like this glow coming from outside of my window. I was on the second story floor and it was like a light just shone, like the window just got brighter and something said, jump out of it. And I thought like, well, if I jump, where am I going to go? And so all my family lived in Ohio. We was in Georgia. My mother moved us to Georgia. So we were like isolated from everybody. And I was barefoot. I jumped out this window and all I could see, I saw this big field behind my house and I was bleeding. My eye was busted. I had blood all over my shirt and barefoot. I ran through my backyard. I jumped this fence and there was a church on the other side and I ran, I got help. And that was kind of where everything started. And I would like to say like that was the day that everything changed and God came and, you know, rainbows and gold. But I believe that was the day that like I hit rock bottom because at that point I was abandoned. We were taken into the system. Me and my sister were taken into the system and my mother left us there. She never, it was like.
How old were you at this point?
16. I was 16.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how old was your sister that you walked in on?
15.
Okay.
She was 15.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And so they took us into the system, and that's kind of where we spent a little bit of our teenage years until I was a fighter. At this point, I was so angry. I fought everybody. I got kicked out of every school that I went to. I was being moved around so much, and eventually ended me up in jail. And as a juvenile, I was in this, what I felt like was a prison in Georgia. And that was where, I feel like everything changed for me. But I never thought that I would be a writer. I never thought that that would transpire into me writing a book. And so as a child, I tried to chase this healing that wouldn't come by the things that I was doing to try to gratify it. I turned to gangs. I turned to drugs. I turned to whatever gave me some sense of comfort. And gave me some sense of just, being secure in who I am, and being this fighter and this gang member gave me a confidence that I didn't have before, this boldness. And when I turned 18 or 19, I met my husband. And when I met him, we met as friends. I was in a relationship with a woman at the time, so it wasn't as if we were meeting and trying to date. But I met him and we just became really good friends. He started inviting me to church and play basketball. And at that point, it was like I started to try to develop a relationship with God, but I was scared because I kind of blamed God for my past and my history. So it was a long journey. And like I said, the story is really long, and I'm still, kind of going through the process of my story because it still isn't over, and God is still doing some things in my life. But last year, not last year, the year before, 2019, when we moved down here to Texas, I thought I was coming here to still be a police officer. That was where I left my career, and I thought I was still coming here to do that. But God shut every door for me to be able to continue that career. And that sent me into a depression. It sent me into a really bad depression because I had found my identity in being a cop. I finally was able to have a life where I felt like I belonged. I had the finances, I had the family, I have 3 beautiful children and a husband. And so when all that was taken away from me, it forced me to have to look back at my trauma and the things that I had never healed from, that I was just hiding behind all of these material things. And so that depression really took me out. It left me in bed for months to where I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't interact with my family. I was just hopeless. And that was pretty hard for me.
That's a rough place to be, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a dark place because I didn't see a way out.
Right.
I didn't see a way out. And so that was kind of where my story started to develop, to where I started writing.
That's so awesome to see where you were and where you are now. Yes. And that little spark of faith that you talk about, I have written about that time and time again. I believe that God instills that in us, and it takes one awful lot to put that little spark out. Yeah. It's there, and we never know what's going to ignite it. And for you, obviously, it got ignited. So it shows in your face, in your smile, in your. Well, it does. You. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
It really is. You're welcome. Yes.
I think it's interesting to me too. As I'm a minister. And I always find this tension within the church culture where the church generally does so much damage for survivors, for embracing abusers. I talk and write about that a lot, where the church is the one place where innocent people should feel safe for a short time, for the time that they're there. Yeah. And ironically, it's the one place where we practice cheap grace, and, we bring abusers in and we're like, oh, you're just supposed to love everybody. And, they see the alligator tears that your stepdad gave, and they're like, well, they might have done these things, but they're really sorry for what they've done. Yeah. And so the church welcomes abusers with open arms. But then there's this other side of it where God is so powerful that he takes really, really broken people. And I mean, the absolute most horrific stories that I've ever heard of trauma, it's always God who who rescues them, who pulls
Yeah.
them out of that, whether they believe in God or not.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
speaking of
And
church
that's your
hurt,
story.
that's kind of where I think that was where let's say where God tried to save me. And I believe that the church that I went to at the time when I decided to give my life with Christ, it taught me religion.
Yeah.
And the fact that I learned about religion before God's love, it caused me to try and fix up my outer appearance and try to look a certain way to just fit in at the church. Because I remember sitting in one of these pastors' office, and I know it was God speaking to me, because at this point, like I told you, I didn't believe in God, but God was speaking to that little piece of faith that he put in me. And it couldn't be anyone but God, because I had never told this man my story. And so what I tried to do, because at the time I carried the image of a male, I dressed like a male, I behaved like a male, I carried that whole appearance of just covering up my body and covering up who I truly was. And the part that got to me is that the church was more focused on changing that than they were as far as my healing and my story and telling me about God's love and allowing God to do it organically. Because one thing that I like to tell people is God wasn't trying to stop me from being gay. God was trying to heal me and heal the broken parts of me. And I believe that in him doing that, it would have changed what I was attracted to. But the reason why my attractions were where they were, because that was my safe place and I didn't feel safe anywhere else. And so church for me ruined that for me, because it caused me to, when I will have thoughts, it caused me to feel like I wasn't good enough because I wasn't in my word enough. Maybe you didn't pray enough. So except when my thoughts were causing me in a way to respond to my fears, So when I came to the church, it was like, okay, you're supposed to be married to him. The person, my husband, who actually brought me to church, thank God we ended up married. But that was what was being told to me. Like, this is who God sent to you. And I'm like, I don't feel
so you didn't marry your husband because the church told you had to.
I did. And that's where that's why I went wrong, is because, and that was so hard. And when I say that God is still working on us, is when I married my husband, because I felt like religion told me to, like, this is what I have to do to be accepted by God. This is the life that I'm supposed to live. So once I begin to walk out those biblical footsteps, then God is going to open some miracle door in heaven to say, I am finally pleased with you. Now let me pull away all those things that has you broken. And I feel like what the church doesn't do is it doesn't help people with trauma. It tries to teach them religion as if religion was going to heal them from trauma. And from being a person who was in this church for years, it finally got me to the point where one day in church, I said, I have to get out of here. I said, because if I don't get out of here, then either I'm going to turn away from God or I'm going to probably end up hurting myself. Like, it was those two choices. It wasn't an option to stay. And I ended up dating my husband. I changed my life. I left what I felt like, okay, this is sin. And I did it in, I feel like, the worst way possible, because I hurt a lot of people in a way that I chose to do it. And I thought that walking away from this lifestyle and then dating my husband, I'm coming into this relationship broken. I had not given God the time to heal me from the trauma that I had. And because of that, I was further traumatized in the beginning of me and my husband's relationship when we were dating. We ended up being intimate because I thought that's what I had to do if I want to keep them. It was kind of like this thing that men put in my perspective, where if I wanted them to love me, I wanted them around, I had to give them my body. And so even though my husband was in the church, we ended up sleeping together. I ended up getting pregnant. Well, what does church tell you? You can't have a baby out of wedlock. You have to get married. This is the way that the guy wants it to be done. And I remember going to counseling, telling my pastor how I was feeling and how, sorry I was for getting pregnant, how it was never my intention. We literally were intimate one time and it happened. And I feel like that's all it takes. But I remember being told that next Sunday in church, after this session, he was in the pulpit and he started to preach to what I came to counseling for. Like, the reason why things aren't going right in people's lives is because y'all are shacking up and all these different things. So I'm in church feeling convicted, like, okay, well, how do I make it right? And we were told, like, well, the way to make it right is to get married. And so I'm like, okay, my son is due in February. So how do I rush a wedding? My belly is getting bigger. So how do we do it? And it was like, well, you have to do it in secrecy, because the Bible says don't let your left hand know what your right hand doing. So we didn't even tell our families. We didn't tell our family. So now we're in this church. And when I tell you, if Uber and Lyft was available the day I got married, I would have been out of there, but the pastor's wife gave me a ride, and I'm downstairs and I'm nervous. It was so bad that when we were doing the rehearsal, he had to tell me to look my husband in the eyes when I was saying it, but I didn't mean anything I was saying. I was afraid. And so I was like, well, if I run, I do love my husband at this point. I did have a deep love for him, but I'm like, if I run, will I lose him? Like, will I lose this relationship? And so I stood in the church and I lied before God because I didn't love my husband. I didn't love him in the way that I felt like you should before you get married. And I didn't have those feelings. And so what I realized was, me and my husband were talking the other day, is we never dealt with the trauma. And so because I did that, me and my husband went through hell in the beginning of our relationship because I was afraid to be intimate with men. He couldn't understand it. I struggled with my own identity. So when I felt unsafe in my marriage, I wanted to be back with women because I was like, I can't do this. Like, I can't be this person. I can't be comfortable, you know, in a marriage bed. I can't be comfortable with that stuff. And so it was really, really hard. It was really hard. And I feel like church taught me that. And then God ended up reaching me to the place he got me to another church that taught me about his love. And I was like, whoa, like, this is totally different than what I was learning before. Like, this is freeing. It was like, literally, I felt like God was just ripping away things that I had been taught. Because when I first went to this church, I was like, oh, the pastor's wife got holes in her jeans and she's wearing jeans on stage when this church told me you're supposed to wear a skirt. Like, women can't be on the stage with a skirt on. And I started to unlearn religion and learn love. And I feel like that's when that faith in me began to grow, because I started to see who God really was.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful.
There are so many parts of your story that could be taken, and just each section could relate to so many people, Janitta. People struggle today with their identity and often are criticized and judged and immediately told you're wrong, you're sinful, you know, but nobody seems to bother to get to the root of things. You know, how did this happen? Why is this going on? And when you're saying that within the church, they're worried about exterior things, very exterior, how we present ourselves to others, what we look like. We have to dress a certain way, speak a certain way, act a certain way.
Have the right mood when you walk in the door.
Fit the profile. That's not who God is. God takes us where we are. And I think of him as scooping us up, broken and a sloppy mess that we are, and just loves us to pieces. Like when you were talking about when you were in law enforcement, and I'm sure you wanted to scoop up those little children that were hurting. I'm sure many were dirty and needed clothes and baths, and who cares? You love them. You wanted to love them. That's our God. That's our God. And I think so many people hurt within the church because they haven't met God yet. They haven't met our Father yet. So you've addressed that. You've addressed so many different issues about the fears that you struggle with yet. Every man you knew disappointed you and hurt you and just, traumatized you. So how are you supposed to look at a man and understand this one's going to be different? But Jimmy, I didn't mean to take over, but it's just so, your story is so powerful. Just so many people are hurting out there and need to hear your story.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so many layers to your story too that I think people are going to relate to, because there's, first of all, there's the trauma, there's the overall theme of trauma, and just people generally don't know how to process trauma because churches don't allow it. They don't allow trauma. A lot of them. Right. I mean, some do. Some are fantastic at allowing people to process their trauma and talk about their trauma, but there is this inherent expectation that you take whatever it is that you're dealing with and you just lay it at God's feet, and God's going to, wave his wand and you're going to be better. And if it's not, then you don't have enough faith, or, we have all these cliches that we throw at people, or you're doing something in secrecy that must be bad, that God's not healing you. We hear all those things. So there's that layer of trauma. And then, I really relate to your, the identity crisis that you faced. Like, I talk about that a lot. I was born in 1979, right in between. I don't have a label, so I'm right in between Generation X and millennials. 1979 doesn't have a label. But I'm a middle child, number 6 out of 11, 5 older, 5 younger.
Poor Jimmy, right?
So I already was messed up to begin with. And then when we found out that my dad was an abuser, I mean, I idolized him. Mm-hmm. And, it was the polar opposite of your stepfather and what you had gone through. We didn't know he was abusing, and I idolized him. And so, that whole world came crashing down. So there's the identity crisis. And then, the acting out sexually, or like with you, you didn't trust men, so you migrated to women, and that makes sense. And there are just so many layers to this in the church. I mean, the teen pregnancy, there's so many layers to this that I want churches to get and understand that trauma is messy. Mm-hmm. There is no instant fix. There is no healing. There is no telling people you need to behave this way and God will make your life better. Like, it doesn't work that way. God reaches down into a very broken world, and he protects the innocent from those who consume them, who oppress them, and who steal from them, who rob their souls of something valuable. God protects those people, and then he reaches into their life and he really carries people. He lifts them up and he protects people.
Well, I love your explanation of God working from the inside out. Yeah. God enters. I feel like God enters within, and God changes us from within, and eventually whatever needs to be changed outside in our behaviors, our thinking, our speech, that changes by our knowing God. Simply by our, yes.
I think the problem and I hate to, say it sometimes, but I think the problem in the church is that we, because I'm going to say we, because the church is a body, we are so busy trying to change people that we don't allow God to do it himself.
I agree.
Yeah.
And because we're trying to change people, we give people the wrong message. So I felt like the church made me believe me being gay caused me to be on my way to hell. Mm-hmm. And when they did that, they outright just went against what God's word says, because sin doesn't send you to hell. Your unbelief does. And it clearly says that in the Bible. But what they try to do is they try to fix that up to make it seem like that what you do can send you to hell. If my sin sent me to hell, then Jesus died for nothing. And it took for me to see God myself and truly learn about God's love. Mm-hmm. And the moment I became comfortable with knowing that God understood where I was and he called my broken beautiful, because the church wants me to believe that my brokenness is ugly to God, that God doesn't, love me because of my brokenness, and God can't use me because of my brokenness. Right.
Yeah.
But the moment that I became comfortable with knowing, okay, God, I believe who you are. I believe that you sent your son to die for me. I'm surrendering and submitting to your process, because my brokenness and my healing didn't start till last year. That was the first time. I tell people I've been in church since 2008, but I believe I didn't get saved in 2019, because God had to unteach me religion and unteach me the things that I had been taught, to tell me who he really was, so that way I can give the right message to people. Yep. Because had I come out with my story from a religious mindset, I would have been doing the same thing. I would have been trying to get people to change. Hey, you got to stop the way you dress, and hey, you better stop talking, because if you sin, then God can't reach you and God can't use you. Yep. Being gay wasn't what kept me from God. Me not believing who God was and in his power is what kept me from healing. So if we allow God to change people, and we do the one thing he tells us to do, which is to love, that's it. Mm-hmm. God tells you to love and be an example. And I have a sister that's struggling with that lifestyle, and she's like, well, maybe you can help me change. And I said, listen, I'm going to show you who God is by the way that I live my life. And I'm going to love you, and I'm going to be here to support what it is that you're going through. Mm-hmm. But I'm not going to try to change you. I said, God is going to heal you first. Yeah. And I'm explaining to her these steps, but I could have came in when I came to her and been like, well, we got to change the way you dress first. And that's what happened to me. Mm-hmm. I was taken to a clothing store. We were supposed to go on a church trip. and I was dressed in my jeans, my baggy jeans, my shirt. I was comfortable.
Yeah.
And they took me to this clothing store. You can't wear that because the pastor's not going to let you go if you wearing that shirt. So we got to change and give you these clothes. So here I am in clothes that make me uncomfortable. And the moment I put these tight clothes on, the first man that looked at me, it was like you could feel a snake crawl up my neck.
Yeah.
I was so uncomfortable, but I wanted to be accepted by God. And so I wanted to be accepted by the church. And I did this. And that's so dangerous in the church because it caused me to hate God. It caused me to feel like, God, I just can't do this because I can't stop lusting after women. But not knowing that the reason I'm lusting is because I'm laying in the bed of fear. Right. I'm literally laying in a bed of fear. And it's not that I miss being a lesbian or I miss being gay. I miss the comfort that lifestyle gave me. I wasn't afraid. And so that's what's dangerous in the church is because when we step out of love and we step into trying to teach people and show people how to live for God instead of allowing God to deal with people in their own specific process, because just because God worked for me like this, he may want to work in Jessica different. Her walk may be different than mine. And I have to be willing to just love her and exemplify who God is in my life by the way that I respond, to my temptations, the way that some people, you find them trying to help people and they end up falling into sin with them. So
that happens a lot. Yes, it does. I've seen that a lot.
Well, I think there's so incredibly much wisdom in what you say. And that's why, a lot of us advocates say, whenever leaders meet at a church and they're talking about abuse or trauma or anything related, like you have to have seats reserved for people who've lived through it. You can't make decisions on behalf of people who've been traumatized when you've never experienced it and you've never put up a chair and allowed somebody who's experienced it to sit there and speak from their heart. And there's incredible wisdom in what you're saying. And this is why you listen to survivors.
You just said something that I feel like is so impactful. And I don't even think you realize it. When I was in my last church, it was a girl who came to me, a young girl. She had to be about 14 or 15. And she told me about a rape that she had experienced by a person in the church. And immediately God told me your story with her because she has to believe that I could bring her from this. Right. So I had my own apartment at this time. My husband was out of town. And I invited a couple of the young girls who had told me they experienced. I said, hey, let me talk to your parents and we're going to see if maybe we can have a girls' night, just share some food, just sit out and talk and just enjoy God's presence. I do this. The girls confirm it with their parents. I go pick them up and we're at my house. And while we're in my living room, my phone started ringing and it was the pastor. And the pastor, I said, yes, sir. How can I help you? Why do you have my girls at your house? And I was like, excuse me. And he literally started to berate me for the reason why I had these girls in my house. So he asked to speak with one of them. And all I heard, she put him on speakerphone. You need to watch who you tell stuff to. You need to quit telling your business. And you come talk to me. And y'all didn't ask me for permission to go over anywhere. And my mind was, why do we need to ask you to do something outside of church?
You don't.
Right.
You don't.
Right.
Yeah.
And it was like this control thing. And so what happened is I got sat down in a church. And whenever I will volunteer to be a part of something, because I used to tell my husband, like, if you won't, like, God gave me a mission to speak to women and people who have been traumatized, who have been abused. But this pastor is making me feel like because I have mistakes, I make mistakes in the church and I'm not good enough to serve God. So I was set down in ministry. I was never able to be used in any capacity. All I could do is be used when they needed me to. They would go on church trips and church events. I was never invited. And this started to hurt. Like this was hurting me because I'm like, okay, well, if God gave me this story and this is the church that I'm in, but I'm not able to use it, then maybe my trauma was for nothing. Then maybe what I went through was for nothing. And that's the danger in the church is because they feel like because you struggle, because you fall short in some areas, which we all do. There's not one person. I don't care if you're a pastor. I don't care if you're a deacon. I don't care if you own multi-campuses. You all have some sort of piece of you that you need to consistently come back to God for. So for you to look down on somebody else who may not be, they might just be a bench sitter. They might be somebody who's just in the church, but God has everybody in different positions. I might be somebody that just sit in the pews and minister, but I'm saving someone's life. And it's like, they look at it like, oh, well, you're not good enough to serve God or to serve in this ministry because you struggle with drinking alcohol from time to time.
Yeah.
And so they disqualify you.
I think that's the irony, is you were disqualified from the one thing that God gifted you to be able, like these girls trusted you because you had been through severe trauma and, you know, you're a leader. You knew how to relate to them. You knew how to talk to them. You knew how to make them feel safe.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing that God gifted you with. Not the only thing, certainly.
I get what you're saying.
But you know what I mean? Like that. If ever there was something that you should have been doing to serve it at that church, that was it.
It was that.
And that was taken from you. Yeah.
When he took that from me, it sent me into like this state of confusion. Like, well, what am I here for? I don't have a purpose then. And so for me, I feel like it was very important. And which led me to my writing was, I'll say this, I never saw myself being a writer. I never wanted to write a book. I was a person who didn't like books. I was a person that if you gave a book, I'd be like, yeah, I'll read it. And then I'll read the back and then I'll Google what it's about. And so that was me. And so I remember as a police officer, God was like, I need you to write your story. And I was like, the biggest vision was film. I always wanted my story to be on TV. That was my goal. So when God said, write your story down, I was like, I'm about to skip that step. Let me find somebody who, let me find someone who does film. And I had, in the second church I went to, there was somebody who did films. He's got Emmys for it. He's been on the Dove Awards.
Wow. Yeah.
I was like, well, let me go tell him. So I go to him and I tell him like, listen, this is my story. I want to make it into a film. He said, you need to write it. And I was like, well, I'm telling you. So do you know somebody that can write it for me? And then we can go from there. Maybe we can sit down and talk. He said, no, you need to write it. So I didn't write it in book format, but I went home. I sat on my phone. I was like, all right, forget it. I'll write it. So I'm just telling a real quick story where I write it in 9 pages. And I come back to him like, look, I wrote it. I sent it to him. And he never read it. And I was like, okay. So he must not want this blessing that I'm trying to give him. So let me find somebody else. And so this whole time I'm being frustrated because nobody is listening to me. And so I go back to my career. I never write it. And then I remember God woke me up in the middle of the night and was like, this is the name of your book, The Secrets of My Mother. And at this time, I hated my mother. And I'm just being honest. At this time, I had no relationship with my mother. We talked from time to time, but I despised her. So I was like, oh, yeah, that's a good title because I'm getting ready to expose her. And I was looking at a way to expose her as a way to get her back and to hurt her. But God wouldn't allow me to write in that season because it was like I had the title, I had the vision of the book, but I wasn't yet ready in my heart to get to the point where I was ready to write with purpose. And so 5 years had went past. We ended up moving to Texas. And when I was in, I would say the worst season of my life, God gave me vision of what he wanted to do. And so I go to my husband and I'm like, I'm fighting to get on police departments. I'm being discriminated against and everything. And I'm trying to contact lawyers and news stations to bust my way into the door to be a police officer because I couldn't figure out why I couldn't get in. And so I go to my husband. My husband was like, well, the last thing I remember you saying that God told you to do, because sometimes we're at our lowest point. We need to go back to the one thing that we know for sure that God said and start there. And he said, God told you to write a book. I'm like, I don't want to write a book. I have 3 kids. We have bills. Our savings is one day going to run out. I have to go get a job. So I was disobedient. I didn't want to do the book. I was like, no, I'm not doing this. I finally get a police job. Finally.
Oh, wow.
And when I tell you, I go into this department and I was miserable. Like I'm talking about, I'm sitting in this police department and I feel like I don't belong. Like there was mornings to where I would get up to go to work, put on my uniform, and I would just cry. And my husband was like, girl, just go to work, just go. And one day I was sitting in the classroom and we were learning about some course. I can't even tell you because I was just so blanked out. And they called me into the office and they were like, I don't know what it is, but we just feel like you don't want to be here. I just broke down crying. I'm talking about, you know what, you're right. You're right. This is, God told me that I'm not supposed to be here. I gotta leave. I'm so sorry. I was like, I know I was supposed to hire other people. And I know I'm literally like a whole baby in this office. And I take off my badge. I take off my ID card. I give it to him. I walk out. I sat in my car. I was like, okay, God, what do you want? You know what I'm like? What is it that you're trying to say that I'm not listening to? And I rode home and I put on my worship music and I just prayed and I cried. And I came home, I sat in my room and I was like, okay, I'll start writing the book. And that was it. That was the beginning. And I would love to say even at that point it was rainbows, because it wasn't. It was a struggle with God to believe the vision that he gave me, that I was able to accomplish it based on what I would like to call my deficiencies. I never wrote a book before. I'm not an author, but the vision that God gave me is even bigger than just this book. This was just like what I would like to consider the degree. It's kind of like I went to school, I wrote the book, and I put it on paper, but the vision was bigger. And so it was a fight for a whole year, me and God just wrestling. It was just wrestling with this book and writing this book. And I even almost stopped it. It was already in printing and I almost stopped the release. So,
wow.
Yes.
Now I really can't wait to read this book. I can't. I am dying to read this book.
So it's coming.
You had this incredibly strained relationship with your mom, understandably. What is your relationship now with your mom?
It's not where I want it to be, but I would say there was healing that occurred and that we're still working through. Because before I was never open to giving her a chance to have a relationship with me.
Yeah.
And the relationship with my mother began, to make the story short, I was on my way to the gym, and there was things that I wrote about in this book, because one thing that God told me was he's going to use me to break generational curses in my family. Right. He said that he showed me that the bondage and the generational curses that I was suffering from, it didn't start with me, but it can stop with me. So when I was writing my book about my story, he said, you can't tell your story without telling your mother's, because you have to be able to show the generational comparison. And so I was riding down the street and I was like, well, gosh, she's not telling me certain things about her past. There's certain things that I need to know about how I came about. There's certain things I need to know about my story, about, I didn't know my father at the time. And she gave me about 3 different men who was the possibility of being my father. But every time I asked her a question, it was like she circled around it. It was never a direct answer. And it was like she was hiding so many things. And I was riding down the street to the gym and I said, well, God, why is she doing this? Like, I can't get her to tell me the story and I can't write the book because I'm at a standstill, because I need to know certain parts. And he said, do you want to know why she won't tell you her story? And I said, why? And he said, because she's afraid of how you might view her. Your mother is afraid to tell her truth because of how she might be perceived. And I was like, okay, well, that makes sense. And God led me to call my mother, and he told me to tell her one specific thing, was that God was going to use even her past to not only change her life, but other women's as well. And that he's going to give her past purpose, but he cannot heal what she won't reveal. He can't heal her past and fix the relationships that she has, because at this time, my mother was still living in guilt. She was still living in guilt. She had 6 children who were all abused by this man, who's all spread out doing different things and have their own crutches. And so as a mother, I could tell continuously year after year, she's fighting to try to get a relationship, but she hasn't healed. So the love that she's trying to give is basically out of guilt and condemnation. It's not out of genuine, it's pure of heart. And so as I told her that, I can feel the freedom in our conversation. And so she ended up telling me certain things about this story, but like I said, it was a process. And so I began to, we went to Atlanta to film the trailer for the book. I did a trailer for it. We went to Atlanta to film it, and that's where my mother lives. And my littlest brother and sister were in it. So I go to her house to pick them up, and me and my mother wasn't speaking at this time. And her husband was like, your mother needs a hug. And I was like, okay, why are you telling me? That's your wife. Go hug her. Like, that's kind of, just, I'm being transparent. That's where I was. I was like, I'm not talking to her. And I mean, that is what it is. And so I picked up my brother, sister, and I leave. And when I tell you, God convicted me so hard, like so hard. And I was like, okay, when I go back, I'll do it. So I go back. I couldn't just walk in and give her a hug. It was like, it had to be a workup process. And it was a friend she had there. And I'm telling her about what God has me doing. And a lady just starts speaking. And she said something about what God had already told me. And so I had an artist that I was booking for my launch, pre-order launch of video. We were doing a live stream. And I was telling them about who this was. My mama came in and sat down, and I played one of his songs. And the presence of God began to like fill the room. The lady, I didn't even know she had a relationship with God, began worshiping. My mother sat down next to me, and she closed her eyes and she began worshiping. And so in that moment, I began to pray for them, and God said, hug her now. Like, now I want you to hug her.
Mm-hmm.
So I go over, I give my mother a hug, and she literally had her phone and something else in her hand, and she drops it, and she stands up, and she just like embraced me so tight. And we stood there and we cried. And I think more was said in us hugging for about 25 to 30 minutes and just both of us crying than could have been said in years of conversation. And I sat down with her and I explained to her the importance of why I have to write this book and that she has to be a part of it, because this is about us and this is about our family. And even though it feels like, you know, God has disqualified us and that there's no purpose for our family, that God's going to use everything that tried to tear us apart and break us to bring glory to his name. But we're able to talk about God's word. We're able to talk about God's promises. And, you know, when she's struggling, I'm able to remind her. When I have my down days, she's able to remind me. And so it's kind of like God is just working there. So I'm okay with just allowing his love to be organic, that this is my mother and I love her, and people who didn't want me to have a relationship with her just have to take it for what it is. But I look at the purpose of something and not the pain of it. And because I look at that there's a purpose of what God took me and my mother through as a child, you know, that she was hurting. You know, I didn't know she was on drugs. I didn't know that this man was causing her to do, you know, cocaine, and, you know, he had her in a bar, and what she went through and how she was abused and her mother never believed her. And that 14 years old, you know, she was struggling with promiscuity because, you know, her parents were on drugs and nobody ever showed her love and attention. So I was able to no longer hate my mother. I was able to finally have compassion, and I was able to have understanding for why she made some of her decisions. And I believe that that's when the healing was able to truly take place.
That's powerful.
Yeah, it really is.
It is. It really, really is.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And I think people don't understand too, like how agonizing of and lengthy of a process that is to make amends. Because, you know, and that's, you know, not to harp on Christianity, because, you know, obviously I'm a believer, you know, I'm a preacher, and like, I love God, I love the church. But I think people crave these instant healing stories where there's like, you know, these relationships where you put them together and, you know, you run off into the sunset and live happily ever after.
Yeah.
And that's not how trauma works. And it never works that way.
That's not how anything works. And I think that's what religion teaches you. They teach you, you know, all of these bad oracles and principles about who God is and how he works. And God lives outside of time. Like, he lives outside of time. And so for me, my 10 years of trying to figure out what God wanted me to do could have been one day for him, you know? So it's kind of more of where, like I said, God is still working. That's why you said, tell you my story is still not finished. You know, God is daily working on things in my relationship, in my marriage, and the vision that he gave me. I have everything that I feel like God spoke to me in my time of prayer, just written right here on my wall, so that I can always remember and I always reflect on it. But it's a journey, and we have to be willing to go along the journey, because that's what God needs. And I feel like if you have a vision, then God can work. But I feel like people make it seem as if God doesn't have a vision for their life. And it's like, no, he just needs a vessel. He just needs someone that's willing to understand that, hey, God, you still love me, even though I feel like you caused me pain. And people make it seem like you have to come to God in a certain fashion, a certain form, with a certain prayer, in a certain, you know, place. There's times where I've been laying in my bed just boohoo crying, pillow soaked, and I'm just talking to God the same way I'm talking to you, and I'm telling God how I'm hurting, how I'm mad at him, and he can handle those things. But people, if people don't feel that they have a place to let that out and a place to go to, especially in the church, they run away from it because they feel like it's something in them that's telling them that they need more. And this church is telling them they have to suppress that part of them in order to look the part, in order to be a part of, you know, this culture that I feel like church has created. And I have stepped outside of that. I stepped outside of that because I feel like God can exist wherever you allow him to come in. And he can heal whatever you release to him.
Everything you're talking about, Janitta, is having a relationship with God. And often the church is talking about the mechanics of religion.
Exactly.
And it messes us up. It does. Messes us up every time. Yeah.
I never was focused on a relationship with God. I just wanted I go to church every Sunday, so people know, oh, don't do that around me because, I worship God, or people like, oh, let me not curse around you because of this. And it's like, I judged people based on religion. And when I got a real relationship with God, I understood how relationship works. How can I be in a marriage with a man knowing that he's going to make a mistake and not disqualifying that relationship and say, oh, well, I got to get a divorce because y'all made a mistake? Well, marriage is the same thing as with God. So when I'm married to God, because I make a mistake, he's not going to throw me away. He's not going to divorce me. He's not going to put me down. He continues to love. And we need to focus on relationship and not religion. That's why when people say, what religion are you? I'm just an obedient believer in God. That's it.
Yes.
I'm obedient to his word as close as I can be. And I believe in everything that he says. And I have faith in what he says he's going to bring to pass. That's where I am. I don't have a religion. I don't believe in religion. I believe religion was a set of rules that were created by people who wanted to control. And so when people say, I don't believe in religion, I don't either. Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah, there's something, trauma definitely causes you to deconstruct. You use that word, and I went through that process too, where, like I was preaching and I just couldn't do it anymore. Now, I told my church, like, I need my 30 minutes with God. Like I want to publicly just call him out for what he allowed. I want to yell at him. I want to scream at him. And I was like, will you guys give me the permission to do that? And they said yes. And I couldn't believe it. And, and I told them, I was like, just so you know, there's no happy ending to this sermon, because that's not where I'm at. Like, I'm at a stage of my life where I am angry with God. And God is big enough that he invites us to share our grief and our sorrow. And I need my 30 minutes with him. And that was a huge turning point for me, where everything that I thought I knew about God, where it had just been put together for me by other people, that all just, it literally just shattered in a second. And it all came coming down, it came tumbling down, and God was standing before me in the raw. And and pain is raw, and trauma is raw. And I saw this picture of God who said, you don't have to pretend anymore. And I think what you experienced is so similar to that. And I think give people the freedom to, when they're angry, they can shout. But when they're sad, they can cry.
I remember I walked outside one day, and I literally was walking up and down my sidewalk yelling at God. I was just yelling at him for how I felt. And I feel like God honors our vulnerability. Yeah. And God wants us to be vulnerable, because when you're vulnerable, you're exposed. And when you are willing to be vulnerable with someone, the biggest thing that it speaks to is that you trust them with your vulnerability. You're not going to open up to a friend who you feel like the moment you're vulnerable, they're going to either make fun of you or make you feel like less of a person. And so when I began to be vulnerable with God, he was like, okay, I see that you really do trust me. Like, that's where my trust was.
That's my kid. And that's what we want out of our kids. We want our kids to be vulnerable with us. We want them to pour out their pain. We want them to jump up and down when they're happy. We want to know where they are. And that's God, our Father. Yeah.
And that's amazing. So I'm happy that you even got to that place, because that's like you said, that's when everything changed. When I was vulnerable, it was like a night and day difference. It was like, okay, God literally finally burned down the house that I had built for myself, and not just burned it down and left me to look at the ashes, but he cleaned it up. And it was just me and him standing there, and piece by piece, we began to lay bricks. And with God's instruction, every brick I laid was the brick he told me to. And daily, I sought after him and sought after his instruction, because I didn't know what he wanted me to do. Last year, I went from making 6 figures to working for Instacart, delivering groceries, and in those moments where when I was able to talk to God, I had my worship music on, and while I'm shopping for people's groceries during what people feel like is one of the worst, years of their lives, because of COVID, I was able to experience with God. I came in contact with people. I prayed for people, and God, there was a purpose in that too. But I could have been like, what you mean I'm going from making 6 figures and now you want me to go deliver groceries? That's humbling. That's a humbling experience. So
it is. Wow. Yeah. But God's using you.
Thank you.
So yeah, hold up a copy of your book again so they can see the cover, The Secrets of My Mother. And where can people order the book?
So it's JanittaNichols.com,
Okay.
where you can get it. But I'm also on Instagram, where I do a lot of my, being able to speak with people, and people can inbox me. But I am Janitta Nichols is my Instagram, and you can click the link in my bio. I also have some shirts I just released called The Blood, Nothing But the Blood. It's for my No More Secrets brand that I started, because I believe that once we reveal our secrets is where our freedom comes. And a lot of people are still held in bondage and held and trapped because of the secrets that they're holding to protect other people. And the moment that they realize that their healing is more important than someone else's image, I believe that's when they can experience true freedom. So I started a brand called No More Secrets. It's not just more apparel, but right now it is. But it has a dove, which symbolizes, a lot to me, like in Isaiah. God, that olive branch, forgiveness. And that's one of the biggest thing I want people to understand is my story couldn't have been as impactful until I learned how to forgive not only my mother, but my abusers, because God loves them too. And it's hard to grasp that concept that God can love, people who do some of the most horrible things. But can you imagine the power in an abuser giving their life to God and verbally speaking out to say, I was an abuser and this is how God used me? There's so much power in that, but most people won't come out because they're afraid of their identity. And I'm not an advocate to say, I used to believe that all of my abusers should go to hell with burning gasoline draws on. That was my opinion. But I want everyone to come to know who God is so they can reach their full potential, because the same enemy that torments them with what their crutch is the same one that torments me. And God created all of us as dirty and evil as some people's lives really are. So my No More Secrets is also for people who are abusers. And I'm letting them know God can use you too. God has a purpose for you too, but you have to desire that purpose, and you can't be afraid of your testimony. Your testimony has some secret parts. And even in, me telling my story, I was an abuser. I abused women. I manipulated them because of my hurt. I just wanted from them what made me feel good. I would jump from relationship to relationship I wanted all these different people to love me and be attached to me. So now I'm, dating all these different women to just get other women to fall in love with me. I did it on purpose. It became a game. Like, well, if I can get her to fall in love with me, then I can get what I want. And I did those things. And so I believe that abuse people. And the moment that we can also set the abusers free, we can make this world a better place.
That's very powerful. Yeah. There's a short video, you said?
Yeah. So
how do people find that?
You can see that on YouTube. I'm not going to lie. After I released the video, I wanted to scale back because there's profanity in it. And I felt like God wanted me to be vulnerable, but I wasn't thinking about the audience part. I was just I want to tell you exactly how people were and what they did. So there is some hard parts to watch in it. But if you look up my name on YouTube, you'll see The Secrets of My Mother trailer. But if you go on my Instagram, it's also in the link in my bio. And the trailer was just the day that I found my stepdad molesting my sister. And there's a poem on there that speaks to it as well. It's very powerful and impactful. But like I said, I hired someone to pretty much have her hair the same way mine was, have on the same clothes. And she's barefoot running through the backyard of this house, which is the actual house that I jumped out of the window on.
Wow.
So I went back and I created it. And then on the back, this was the church that I ran to. So
wow.
Yeah. So
yeah. Very powerful.
Can't wait. Cannot wait. Seriously.
But let me say that God gave me this whole vision. I mean, from the title to the cover, I had to fly. I didn't have the money. When God gave me this vision, I had not $1 to produce this book and $1 to shoot the film. God provided all the resources to bring about his vision. So even if someone believes that God is telling them to do something, he don't need you to make the provisions. He just needs you to believe and take the first step. Because I went to Atlanta. I scouted this house. I tried to get the lady to be involved. I hired cast. I had to fly them to Atlanta to put this on. And when I was trying to come up with the cover, it was a dream. God gave me a dream of what he wanted the cover to look like. So I hurry up and try to make it myself, however I could, so that I could not forget it.
Right.
And when I was getting my cover design, I sent it to the people who made my cover, and they came back with something that was totally different. They kept the image, but they put the church behind the girl, and it was like fire all around her.
Yeah.
And it immediately grieved my spirit because I said, no, oh my God, this is not what God told me to do.
Yeah.
I can't use that. Like, I need you to, I don't care if it looks simple. I don't care if it looks Hollywood.
I love
It has
that
to
cover.
look,
Yeah.
it has to look the way that God told me to do it. And so I sent it back and I said, no, do it like this. And so it came out perfect.
Wow. Yeah. Very cool. Well, Janitta Nichols, thank you so much for being with us and for sharing your story.
This was an awesome,
so powerful. Yeah.
Very awesome.
I hope we can do this again one day, but this is definitely awesome. And I thank you guys for extending your platform. And it's a breath of fresh air to know that you're believers. I'll tell you that.
Awesome. Well, very cool. So to our listeners, we will link up in the description to all the links that Janitta mentioned, and order your copy. Help her out and get her story, and I think you'll be blessed.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next episode.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. Thank you to our patrons who make the podcast possible. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker and search for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. If you believe in what we do, consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron, and check out the cool rewards our patrons receive. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.